A woman's hands can run a ranch, but they can't sign the papers to keep it. Abigail Hayes knew this truth in her bones, a bitter lesson passed down from her father's early grave. The Montana prairie stretched vast and unforgiving around her, but this land was hers, every dusty acre earned with her own sweat and calloused hands. The wind whipped a strand of brown hair across her face as she stood on the porch of the small ranch house her father had built. Dust clung to her worn denim trousers and the frayed cuffs of her work shirt. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where a lone rider kicked up a trail of dirt, heading straight for her. He was not a neighbor. He was a harbinger, a vulture circling the life she had fought so hard to protect. Abigail's jaw tightened. She had been expecting him. She had been dreading him. The letter from Mr. Warren Carmichael sat on her kitchen table. Its polite, predatory words burned into her memory. The writer, a man named Peters who worked as Carmichael's errand boy, dismounted without grace. He avoided her steady gaze, his eyes darting from the well-kept barn to the healthy-looking cattle in the near pasture. He seemed surprised that a woman alone could manage such order. "Miss Hayes," he began, holding out a folded paper. "Mr. Carmichael sent this. He says you'll understand what it means." Abigail didn't take it. "I understand what the last letter meant. Tell him my answer is the same. The debt is a lie. My father settled his accounts before he passed." Peters shifted his weight, his discomfort obvious. "Mr. Carmichael has the bank ledgers, miss. Says your father used the ranch as collateral on a loan for seed and stock 3 years ago. The interest has come due. A loan he paid off," she said, her voice low and firm, betraying none of the cold fear gripping her stomach. "I have the receipts." "Receipts can be misplaced. Ledgers are final," Peters mumbled, placing the notice on the porch railing when she refused to take it. "There's a town council meeting tomorrow. Judge Miller wants you there. Mr. Carmichael will be presenting his claim." He turned to leave, eager to be gone. "And if the council sides with him?" Abigail asked, though she already knew the answer. Peters paused, his hand on his saddle horn. He finally looked at her, a flicker of something that might have been pity in his eyes. "Then the Carmichael Cattle Company takes possession of the Hayes Ranch by week's end." He swung himself onto his horse and rode away, leaving Abigail alone with the suffocating silence. The foreclosure notice fluttered on the railing, a white flag of surrender she had no intention of raising. She walked over and picked it up, her fingers crushing the paper. This ranch was her father's legacy and her only home. She had poured her blood and tears into its soil. Warren Carmichael wanted it not for a phantom debt, but for its water rights. The deep, reliable creek that cut through her property was the lifeblood of this entire valley. That night, sleep offered no escape. She lay awake, the weight of the prairie pressing down on her. Every creak of the house sounded like her father's footsteps. Every gust of wind whispered of failure. She had promised him she would never let the ranch go. It was a promise she intended to keep, even if it meant fighting the whole town to do it. The next morning, she rode into the small town of Prairie Dust. She had cleaned up as best she could, swapping her work clothes for a simple, practical dress, her hair pulled back in a severe knot. She would not give Carmichael the satisfaction of seeing her look defeated. The meeting hall was already full. The air was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and cheap tobacco. She saw the faces of her neighbors, some sympathetic, some curious, some openly siding with the wealthiest man in the county. Warren Carmichael sat at a table near the front, looking calm and prosperous in his tailored suit. He was a man who had built an empire by absorbing the misfortunes of others. He gave her a small, confident nod, as if her ruin was already a settled matter. Judge Miller, a man whose spine seemed to bend in the direction of money, called the meeting to order. "We are here to discuss the matter of the outstanding debt on the Hayes property," he announced, his voice lacking any real authority. Carmichael stood, his movements smooth and practiced. He presented his case with a stack of papers and a ledger book, his voice dripping with false regret. "No one dislikes this sort of business more than I do," he said, addressing the room. "George Hayes was a good man. But business is business. The loan was made, the terms were clear, and the debt remains unpaid." "That's not true." Abigail's voice cut through the room, sharper than she intended. She stood, her hands clenched at her sides. "My father paid what he owed. Mr. Carmichael is using this to steal my land for the water. A murmur went through the crowd. Everyone knew how valuable her creek was, especially with the dry season approaching. Carmichael sighed dramatically. "Miss Hayes, I understand your distress. It is a difficult position for a young woman to be in. Perhaps if your father had left a son to manage his affairs." Rage, hot and blinding, flared in Abigail's chest. A son would not have made him any more honest. Judge Miller banged his gavel. "Miss Hayes, you will maintain a civil tongue." She presented her own records, a small, worn book of receipts her father had kept. Carmichael dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "Easily forged. My bank's ledgers are ironclad." The council members exchanged nervous glances. They were small-time ranchers and shopkeepers, men who depended on Carmichael's bank for their own loans. None of them would risk his displeasure for the daughter of a dead man. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. "The council finds the claim to be valid," the judge declared, his eyes fixed on his desk. "The property will be transferred to Mr. Carmichael to settle the debt." The words felt like a physical blow. The room began to spin. This was it. Everything she had worked for was gone. But just as despair began to settle in, the mayor, a portly and indecisive man named Henderson, cleared his throat. "There might be another way," he said, sweating under Carmichael's cold stare. "A legal alternative." Everyone turned to him. "The Territorial Homestead Act," the mayor continued, gaining a sliver of confidence. "It has a provision to encourage the settlement and development of land. Certain properties can be consolidated. If two adjacent parcels are legally joined, the new, larger property is granted a temporary stay from creditors to ensure its stability. A grace period of 1 year. Carmichael's smile tightened. "And what adjacent parcel would that be?" "Her land borders mine on 3 sides. Not on the 4th, the mayor said quietly. "To the west, her land borders the old coal place." A hush fell over the room. The name hung in the air, thick with tragedy and whispers. The coal place. It had belonged to Sheriff Martha Cole, a woman respected and admired by all, who had been shot down during a bank robbery 6 months prior. Now it was home to her widower, Jacob Cole, a man the town no longer knew what to do with. He was a ghost, a recluse haunted by his wife's violent end. The properties could be joined by marriage, Judge Miller said, seeing a path that might appease Carmichael without completely ruining a young woman. A union between Miss Hayes and Mr. Cole would create a single, larger ranch. The law would protect it for a year. It would give them time to sort out their finances. The suggestion was absurd, a desperate, archaic solution to a modern problem. Yet, in the stifling confines of the town hall, it began to take on a strange logic. Abigail stared at the judge in disbelief. Marry a man she barely knew? A man who was a living monument to grief? "That's preposterous," Carmichael scoffed, though a flicker of calculation showed in his eyes. He knew the town wouldn't look good forcing a woman from her home. This offered a public-spirited compromise while he waited for his prize. "Bring Mr. Cole in," the judge ordered. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She had seen Jacob Cole from a distance, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette working his land, always alone. He never came to town unless necessary. They said he was a former lawman himself. Some said a soldier. But whatever he had been before, he was now just the town's tragic figure. The door opened, and Jacob Cole stepped inside. Silence followed him like a shroud. He was taller than she remembered, his dark hair unkempt, a shadow of a beard on his jaw. His face was hard, carved from granite, but his eyes were the color of a winter storm, and they held a deep, settled sorrow that startled her. He wore simple work clothes, clean but worn, and he moved with a quiet purpose that seemed at odds with his reputation as a broken man. He had clearly been summoned, not invited. His gaze swept the room, missing nothing, before landing on Abigail. He looked at her not with pity, but with a flicker of recognition, as if he understood exactly what it felt like to be cornered. Judge Miller explained the situation, his words clinical and detached. The debt, the foreclosure, the bizarre legal loophole that involved a forced marriage. Throughout the explanation, Jacob's expression remained unreadable. He listened patiently, his hands resting loose at his sides. When the judge finished, the room held its breath, waiting for his response. He didn't look at the judge or the mayor. He looked at Abigail. "What does she say?" he asked, his voice a low rasp, gravelly from disuse. All eyes turned to her. It was her cage to choose. Lose her home and her father's legacy, or chain herself to a stranger, a man drowning in his own ghosts. She thought of her father's calloused hands, of the promise she had made him. She thought of Warren Carmichael's smug, greedy face. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She lifted her chin, meeting Jacob's stormy gaze. "I will not lose my ranch," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. It was the closest she could come to saying yes. A quiet understanding passed between them, two strangers bound by a shared desperation. Jacob gave a single, sharp nod. He turned to the judge. "Fine," he said, the word cracking like a dry twig. "We'll do it." Warren Carmichael watched them, his thin smile returning. He could wait a year. In a year, he was certain, their alliance of misery would crumble, and he would get everything he wanted. Abigail felt a chill run down her spine. She had saved her land, but she had just sold her life. She was to be married to the sheriff's widower, a man whose silence seemed as vast and as lonely as the prairie itself. The wedding, if one could call it that, took place the following morning. There were no flowers, no guests, no words of joy. It was a transaction conducted in the dusty courthouse, officiated by Judge Miller, with the mayor and his wife as reluctant witnesses. Abigail wore the same simple dress from the day before. It felt like funeral attire. She stood stiffly, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Beside her, Jacob stood like a statue, his face a mask of indifference. He had put on a clean shirt, but it did little to soften his rugged, sorrowful appearance. He smelled of pine, soap, and something wild, like the open range after a rain. The judge read the vows in a hurried monotone, eager to be done with the awkward affair. When it came time for Abigail's response, the words caught in her throat. "I do" was a promise, a sacred thing. To speak it here, under these circumstances, felt like a blasphemy. She forced the words out, a choked whisper that was barely audible. Jacob's "I do" was a low rumble, devoid of any emotion. It was the sound of a man agreeing to the terms of a contract, nothing more. They didn't exchange rings. There was no pretense of affection, no illusion to maintain. The judge pronounced them husband and wife, and the silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. They walked out of the courthouse into the stark morning light, now legally bound, yet still perfect strangers. Her horse and his were tied to the same hitching post, a detail that seemed both practical and cruelly symbolic. "I'll follow you out of the place," he said. It wasn't a question. Abigail simply nodded, unable to speak. She mounted her mare, her movements stiff. He swung onto his own horse with an easy, practiced grace. They rode out of prairie dust side by side, a foot of empty space between them, a chasm of unspoken thoughts and feelings. The ride to her ranch, their ranch, was agonizingly quiet. The familiar landscape felt alien to her now. The rolling hills, the hawks circling in the vast blue sky, the scent of sagebrush on the wind. It was all the same, but she was different. She was no longer just Abigail Hayes, landowner. She was Mrs. Cole, a title that felt as foreign and ill-fitting as a borrowed dress. She kept glancing at the man beside her. He rode with his eyes forward, his jaw set. What was he thinking? Did he regret this absurd bargain already? She knew the town's gossip about him. They said he'd been a different man when Sheriff Cole was alive, that he used to smile. Some whispered that he had failed her, that a man should have been able to protect his wife, especially a wife who wore a badge. They saw him as a living reminder of what they had lost. Abigail wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Did he see a partner in this desperate pact, or just another burden, another complication in a life already defined by loss? When they reached the ranch house, the sight of it brought a fresh wave of anxiety. This had been her sanctuary, her fortress. Now she had to share it. Jacob dismounted and, to her surprise, walked over to her horse, his hand outstretched to help her down. It was a simple, courteous gesture, but it felt deeply intimate. His fingers were calloused and warm as they briefly brushed hers. A strange jolt, like static electricity, shot up her arm. She pulled away quickly, her face flushing, and slid down from the saddle on her own. He seemed not to notice, or at least he gave no sign that he did. His gaze was already sweeping over the property, a critical, assessing look in his eyes. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at the barn, the corrals, the line of fence stretching toward the west. "The north fence needs mending," he said, his first words since leaving town. "Cattle will walk right through it with the first storm." A spark of indignation flared within her. "I was getting to it. That fence borders Carmichael's land. He'd like nothing more than for our stock to wander onto his property. It'd give him another claim against us." His logic was sound, infuriatingly so. He saw the ranch not as a home, but as a territory to be defended. He was thinking like a soldier mapping out his perimeter. "The house has 2 bedrooms," she said, changing the subject abruptly. "You can take the one at the back. It was my father's." He gave a slight nod. "I'll get my things from my place tomorrow. Won't be much." He turned and began walking the fence line, his long strides eating up the ground. Abigail was left standing alone in the yard, feeling like an intruder in her own life. She watched him go, a tall, lonely figure against the endless prairie. He was already at work, already taking on the role he had been forced into. Inside, the house felt different, charged with his presence, even though he was still outdoors. She walked into the small, clean kitchen, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. She had scrubbed this house from top to bottom after her father died, erasing the lingering sin of sickness, trying to reclaim it as her own. Now, a new presence had entered, one she could not scrub away. She began to prepare a midday meal out of pure, mechanical habit, chopping vegetables, stoking the fire in the stove. The familiar tasks were a comfort, a way to anchor herself in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. When Jacob finally came inside hours later, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. He was covered in dust and sweat, and there was a long, bloody scratch along his forearm where he must have caught it on barbed wire. He stopped just inside the doorway, as if unsure of his right to enter. He held his hat in his hands, his hair damp against his forehead. "I fixed that section of fence," he said, "and the gate on the east corral." The hinge was about to give. "I saw," she said, her voice softer than she intended. She gestured toward the table. "There's stew." He seemed surprised. "You don't have to cook for me. If we're going to run this ranch together, we're going to eat together," she stated, setting 2 bowls on the table. It was a declaration, a setting of new rules for this new life. He washed his hands and face at the pump by the sink, the splashing water loud in the quiet kitchen. When he sat down opposite her, the small table felt crowded. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons against pottery. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't entirely hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say because they had everything to say. Abigail's eyes kept drifting to the gash on his arm. It was deeper than she'd first thought, still oozing blood. "That needs cleaning," she said, her voice flat. He glanced down at it as if he'd forgotten it was there. "It's fine. It'll get infected," she insisted. "Sit still." She rose and came back with a basin of warm water, clean rags, and a bottle of carbolic acid. She knelt beside his chair. When she reached for his arm, he flinched almost imperceptibly, a subtle tightening of his muscles. "I can do it," he said, his voice low. "You'll do a poor job of it," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. She took his arm gently, her touch surprisingly steady. His skin was warm, his muscles hard as stone beneath her fingers. As she carefully cleaned the wound, she saw that it was just one mark among many. His arms were a road map of old scars, thin white lines from knives, a puckered circle on his bicep that looked suspiciously like a bullet wound. This was a man who had known violence. He was not just a grieving widower. He was something more, something harder. She dabbed the antiseptic on the fresh cut, and he drew a sharp breath through his teeth, his jaw tight, but he made no other sound. Her hands, usually so steady with reins or a rifle, trembled slightly. She wasn't just tending to a wound. She was touching his history, the silent, painful stories etched into his skin. She finished her work, wrapping a clean strip of cloth around his forearm. "Thank you," he said, his voice a quiet rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. His winter storm eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, the sorrow in them was replaced by something else. A flicker of gratitude, of surprise. She pulled back, suddenly flustered by the intensity of his gaze, by their proximity in the lamplit kitchen. "We have to work together," she said, more to herself than to him. "Can't have you laid up with a fever." She retreated to the other side of the room, her heart beating a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. They were husband and wife, partners in a desperate gamble. But as the first day of their forced marriage drew to a close, Abigail realized she knew nothing about the scarred, silent man sitting at her kitchen table. And that, she suspected, was a more dangerous unknown than any debt owned by Warren Carmichael. The days that followed fell into a strange, monotonous rhythm, a quiet truce governed by shared labor and unspoken boundaries. Jacob was the first one up, long before the sun, the smell of fresh coffee his only announcement. By the time Abigail came into the kitchen, he would be gone, already out checking the herds or mending whatever part of the ranch her father had let fall into disrepair. He worked with a relentless, tireless energy, as if physical exhaustion was the only thing that could quiet the ghosts that haunted him. They spoke very little. Their conversations were transactions, stripped down to the necessities of running the ranch. "The creek is running low. We need to move the herd to the south pasture. The wagon lost a wheel." Each sentence was a tool, used to get a job done, then put away. Yet, in the silence, Abigail began to learn him. She learned him in the way he expertly reshod a horse, his large hands surprisingly gentle and precise. She learned him in the neat stacks of firewood he left by the back door, saving her the trouble. She learned him in the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, an old habit from a life she couldn't begin to imagine. He was a good rancher, better than good. He had an instinct for the land and the animals that rivaled her own. He saw things she missed. A calf showing early signs of sickness, a subtle shift in the weather patterns, the faint tracks of coyotes near the chicken coop. A grudging respect began to grow in her, taking root in the barren soil of their arrangement. The town, however, was not so quiet. On her weekly trips to prairie dust for supplies, Abigail felt their eyes on her. The whispers followed her down the main street, clinging to her like burrs. She was now a subject of gossip, a story told in hushed tones over sewing circles and saloon bars. A shameful thing, she heard Mrs. Gable, the butcher's wife, mutter to a friend outside the mercantile. Barely a decent mourning period for her father, and she takes up with that one. And him, the friend whispered back, casting a nervous glance over her shoulder. He couldn't even keep his own wife safe. What good can he be to her? Abigail kept her chin high, her expression unreadable. She walked into the mercantile, her shopping list clutched in her hand. Mr. Henderson, the shopkeeper and mayor's brother, gave her a sympathetic look. "Don't you pay them any mind, Abigail," he said softly as he weighed out a bag of flour. "Folks in this town have too much time on their hands and not enough charity in their hearts." "I don't," she said, her voice clipped. But it was a lie. The words stung, each one a tiny cut against her pride. She had always been just George Hayes's daughter, a hard-working girl who kept to herself. Now, she was a spectacle. As she was leaving, Warren Carmichael stepped out of the bank across the street. He saw her and tipped his hat, a smug, proprietary smile on his face. He was watching, waiting. He believed their fragile alliance was doomed to fail, and his patience was a threat that loomed larger than any town gossip. That afternoon, the threat became more tangible. While riding the western fence line, the one Jacob had repaired, she found a section cut clean through. 3 of her best heifers were missing. It wasn't the work of rustlers. The cuts were too neat, too deliberate. This was a message. This was Carmichael's doing. Rage burned cold and clear in her gut. She rode back to the ranch house at a gallop, dust flying behind her. She found Jacob in the barn, mending a piece of tack. "Someone cut the west fence," she said, dispensing with any greeting. 3 heifers are gone. Carmichael's men, I'd wager. Jacob's hand stilled. He looked up, his eyes hardening. "Did you see who did it?" "No. But who else would it be? He's testing us, trying to bleed us out, one animal at a time." Without another word, he set down the leather strap and strode toward the door. "Stay here," he commanded. "Like hell I will," she shot back, following him out into the yard as he saddled his horse with swift, efficient movements. "They're my cattle. This is my fight." For the first time, a flicker of something other than sorrow or indifference crossed his face. It looked like frustration. "This is not a fight you know how to win, Abigail. And you do." He paused, his hand on the saddle. His gaze was intense, chilling. "Yes," he said, and the single word carried a weight that made her shiver. It was a confirmation of everything she had suspected about his past. "They won't be expecting me to come alone. They'll be expecting a rancher. They won't be ready for what they get." "You mean what you were," she corrected, her voice sharp. His jaw tightened. "Some things a man never stops being. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me." He swung onto his horse and was gone, riding hard toward Carmichael's territory. Abigail was left standing in a cloud of dust, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and a terrifying, unfamiliar fear, not for her cattle, but for him. She had spent weeks building walls between them, and in a single moment of shared crisis, those walls felt terrifyingly flimsy. She did not lock the doors. Instead, she took her father's rifle from its place over the mantel, checked that it was loaded, and sat on the porch to wait. The sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple. The prairie grew quiet, the birds settling in for the night. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Hours passed. The moon rose, a pale sliver in the dark sky. Doubt began to creep in, cold and sharp. What if he didn't come back? What if Carmichael's men? She pushed the thought away. Their arrangement was business, a means to an end. It was foolish to feel anything more. And then she heard it, the slow, rhythmic clop of a horse's hooves, accompanied by the lowing of cattle. She stood up, the rifle held tight in her hands, her knuckles white. Out of the darkness, Jacob emerged, his horse moving at a weary walk. Behind him, trotting along contentedly, were her 3 missing heifers. Relief washed over her, so powerfully her knees felt weak. He rode into the yard and dismounted, his movements slow and stiff. "You got them back," she said, the words coming out as a breathless whisper. "They were just over the ridge," he said, his voice flat and tired. He started to uncinch his saddle, his back to her. It was then that she saw it, a dark, spreading stain on the left shoulder of his shirt. "Jacob," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. "You're hurt." He paused, then continued with the saddle. "It's nothing. Don't you lie to me," she said, stepping off the porch and marching toward him. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to turn and face her in the moonlight. His face was bruised, a cut splitting his lower lip. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, the fabric soaked through with blood. "Let me see it," she demanded. "I said it's nothing." His voice was a low growl, a warning, but she saw the pain in his eyes, the way he held his arm unnaturally still. She ignored his protest, her frustration overriding any caution. "Get in the house. Now." For a long moment, he stared at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and something unreadable. The air crackled between them. Then, with a weary sigh, he relented. He followed her into the kitchen, the tension from their earlier argument replaced by a new, more intimate one. "Take off your shirt," she ordered, lighting a second lamp to get a better look. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "For God's sake, Jacob, I'm your wife, not some blushing schoolgirl. Let me see the wound." The word wife felt strange on her tongue, a legal fact that had, until this moment, felt like a fiction. Slowly, his fingers clumsy, he unbuttoned his shirt. He shrugged it off his good shoulder first, then eased it carefully off the other, hissing in a sharp breath of pain. Abigail's own breath caught in her throat. In the warm lamplight, his torso was a testament to a brutal past. The old scars she had glimpsed on his arms were nothing compared to this. A jagged, puckered scar ran across his ribs, the clear mark of a knife. Several round, pale scars from old bullet wounds littered his chest and back. And across his back, faint, silvery lines crisscrossed his skin. Whip marks, old and faded, but unmistakable. Her anger and fear evaporated, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow. What kind of life had this man lived? The new wound was a deep gash on his shoulder, ugly and bleeding sluggishly. It was not a bullet or a knife. It looked like he'd been struck with something heavy and sharp. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Carmichael's men were waiting. 3 of them, he said, his voice tight with pain. They weren't interested in talking. 3 against 1. He finally looked at her, and a ghost of a grim smile touched his bruised lips. The odds were about even. She didn't know what to say. She poured whiskey onto a clean rag, the sharp scent filling the kitchen. "This is going to hurt." "It already does," he said through gritted teeth. As she began to clean the wound, he sat rigid on the chair, his fists clenched on his knees. Every touch of the cloth made his muscles contract. She worked with a focus she hadn't known she possessed, her mind numb to everything but the task. Her fingers brushed against his skin, warm and solid. She felt the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her hand. She was acutely aware of him, of his strength, of the deep well of pain he held inside him. The wound needed stitches. Her father had taught her how to put a few crude stitches in a cow, but never a person. Her hands trembled as she threaded the needle. "Hold still," she murmured. He didn't flinch as the needle pierced his skin. He just watched her, his stormy eyes dark and unreadable in the lamplight. She worked in silence, her head bent, her world narrowing to this single, terrible, intimate act. When she was finished, her work was clumsy, but the wound was closed. She bandaged it with clean linen, her movements gentle. When she was done, she stepped back, the basin of bloody water in her hands, her body shaking from a storm of emotions she couldn't name. "Thank you," he said again, his voice hoarse. She just nodded, unable to find her voice. She walked to the sink to dispose of the water, her back to him. "Abigail," he said. She stopped but didn't turn around. "They won't be back for a while," he said quietly. "I made sure they understood the property line is not to be crossed again." She finally turned to look at him. In his eyes, she saw more than just pain and sorrow. She saw a flicker of the man he must have been, a dangerous, protective strength that he had kept hidden away. He hadn't just retrieved her cattle. He had defended their home. Theirs. That night, as she lay in her own bed, the wall between their rooms felt thinner than paper. She couldn't stop seeing the map of scars on his body, each one a question she was afraid to ask. She had entered into a marriage to save a ranch. She was beginning to understand that she had bound herself to a man far more complex and broken than she had ever imagined. And for the first time, she felt a terrifying and unwelcome desire to understand how he had gotten those scars. The incident with Carmichael's men was a turning point. A subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the ranch, as tangible as a change in the wind before a storm. The silence between Abigail and Jacob was still there, vast and deep, but it was no longer empty. It was now filled with the memory of shared danger, of her tending his wounds in the quiet intimacy of the kitchen. Jacob's recovery was swift. He was a man accustomed to pain, who wore it like a second skin. He never spoke of the fight, and Abigail didn't ask. But she saw the way he moved, a little stiffer than before, the way he would unconsciously touch his bandaged shoulder when he thought she wasn't looking. She changed the dressing for him each morning, a silent ritual that became the most intimate part of their day. Her fingers, no longer trembling, would work deftly to clean and rewrap the wound. During those moments, their eyes would sometimes meet, and a current of unspoken understanding would pass between them. It was more than gratitude, more than partnership. It was a fragile, terrifying acknowledgement of the bond being forged between them. Abigail found herself watching him more and more. She noticed the small things. The way his grim expression would soften almost imperceptibly when he watched the new foal in the pasture. The way he would mend a broken tool with a patient, methodical skill that spoke of a man who understood how things were put together and how they could be broken. One afternoon, she found him in the barn, staring at the empty stall that had once belonged to Sheriff Martha Cole's horse. It was the only part of his old life he had brought with him, an empty space that spoke volumes. He was running a hand over the worn wood of the stall door, his touch almost a caress. His shoulders were slumped, the hard lines of his face softened by a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the barn. Abigail stopped, hidden in the shadows, her heart aching with a feeling she refused to name. She had seen him as a soldier, a fighter, a silent partner. In that moment, she saw him only as a husband mourning his wife. The realization was a sharp, painful pang of jealousy, an emotion so foreign and unwelcome it made her feel ashamed. She was his wife in name only. This barn, this land, this life was a cage they shared, but his heart was still buried with another woman. She backed away silently, leaving him to his ghosts. Carmichael, true to Jacob's prediction, left them alone for a while. But his presence was a constant, looming shadow. His ranch hands would ride the property line, watching, their presence a silent form of intimidation. Abigail knew it was only a matter of time before he made his next move. His new strategy was more subtle and far more venomous. He began to poison the town against them. Rumors, like tumbleweeds, began to drift through prairie dust. They said Jacob Cole was a violent man, a dangerous drifter who had brought his trouble to their quiet town. They twisted the story of the fight with Carmichael's men, painting Jacob as the aggressor who had brutally assaulted 3 innocent ranch hands. The change was palpable. When Abigail went to town for supplies, former friends now averted their gaze. Doors that had once been open to her were now quietly closed. The whispers were louder, sharper. They called her foolish, reckless, for tying herself to such a man. They were isolating her, cutting her off from the community she had known her entire life, trying to make her feel so utterly alone that she would have no choice but to surrender. The loneliness was a heavy cloak. She had always been independent, but she had never been truly alone. Now, she was an island, her only inhabitant a silent, scarred man who was a stranger to her. The breaking point came on a Sunday. Abigail had, out of lifelong habit, gone to the small church on the edge of town. As she walked up the steps, she saw the congregation gathered outside, their conversation falling into a sudden, stiff silence. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had known Abigail since she was a child, took a step back, as if Abigail were carrying a contagion. "We don't want his kind here," a man muttered, loud enough for her to hear. The pastor, a weak-willed man named Reverend Michael, came to the door. His face was a mask of strained politeness. "Abigail," he said, his eyes not quite meeting hers, "perhaps it would be more comfortable for everyone if you worship from home for the time being." The public rejection was like a slap in the face. Humiliation burned her cheeks. She turned without a word, her back ramrod straight, and walked away from the church, from the town, from the life she had once known. She did not let the tears fall until she was miles out of town, the prairie swallowing the sound of her sobs. She rode back to the ranch, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She found Jacob by the creek, sharpening an axe on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. "They've turned the whole town against us," she said, her voice raw. He didn't stop his work, but his hands slowed. "I told you this wouldn't be easy." "Easy," she burst out, the dam of her control finally breaking. "I was just thrown out of my own church, the church where my father's funeral was held. They look at me like I'm a disease. They whisper about you, call you a monster. And you say nothing. You just hide out here, letting them believe whatever lies Carmichael feeds them. Do you even care?" He finally stopped, placing the axe carefully on the ground. He stood up and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a deep, weary sadness. "What would you have me do, Abigail?" he asked, his voice low and even. "Ride into town and correct them? Tell them I'm not a monster? Men like Carmichael don't deal in truth. They deal in power. The truth doesn't matter to those people. All that matters is who has the bigger ranch, the fatter wallet. So we do nothing. We just let them win. We let them tear us apart. We survive," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We hold the land. We outlast them. That is how we win. I can't live like this," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "I can't be this alone." He took a step toward her, his shadow falling over her. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "You're not alone," he said, the words sounding foreign and stiff on his tongue. "You have me." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, fraught with a meaning neither of them was ready to explore. He had spoken it as a fact, a term of their contract. But Abigail heard something more in his gravelly voice. A promise. That night, a storm rolled in, the kind of violent prairie storm that feels like the end of the world. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Thunder shook the small house to its foundations. Abigail had always loved storms, but this one felt different. It mirrored the tempest inside her. She sat in the dark living room, watching the lightning split the sky, feeling as though her own world was being torn apart. The door to her bedroom creaked open. Jacob stood there, a silhouette against the darkness of the hallway. "The roof in my room is leaking," he said simply. The storm found an old weak spot. "Oh," she said, her mind struggling to process the practical information. "I'll fix it in the morning," he continued. "But for tonight," he trailed off, the unspoken question hanging in the air. The house had only 2 bedrooms. His was now uninhabitable. The unspoken reality of their marriage, the fact that they lived as roommates, not partners, was suddenly laid bare. He couldn't sleep on the floor. The drafts in the old house were terrible. There was only one other bed. Hers. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. The bed is big enough," she said, the words coming out in a rush. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. It meant nothing. He walked into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't bring a lamp. The only light came from the intermittent, brilliant flashes of lightning. He took off his boots, and the sound seemed deafeningly loud. Abigail remained in the chair by the window, her body rigid. He didn't get into the bed. Instead, he pulled the spare blanket from the foot of it and settled on the floor, his back against the wall, as far from her as he could get. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "This is your room," he said, his voice a low rumble that was nearly lost in the sound of the storm. "I won't intrude." His quiet act of decency, of respect for her space, touched her more than any grand gesture could have. He was an honorable man, trapped in a dishonorable situation. "Jacob," she said, her voice soft, "get off the floor. It's foolish. I'm fine." "Don't be a martyr," she said, a hint of her old fire returning. "It's just a bed. We're adults." He was silent for a long moment. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, he stood up. In the next flash of lightning, she saw him standing by the bed. He was so tall, he seemed to fill the small room. He lay down on top of the covers on the far side of the mattress, his body stiff, a country apart from her. Abigail finally stood and crossed the room, slipping under the covers on her own side. The bed, which had always felt so large and empty, was now charged with his presence. She could feel the heat of his body, could hear the soft sound of his breathing over the roar of the storm. They lay in silence for what felt like an eternity, 2 strangers separated by a few inches of mattress and a universe of secrets. "Why did you marry me?" she whispered into the darkness, the question escaping before she could stop it. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Because Carmichael is a vulture," he finally said, his voice a low vibration in the dark. "And because this land, your land, it reminds me of a place I once knew. A place I was happy." He paused. "And because your eyes, they have the same fight in them that Martha had." The mention of his wife's name was a shock, a cold splash of water. He had never spoken it to her before. It was a confirmation of her earlier fear. He looked at her and saw a ghost. A tear she didn't know as there slid down her temple and into her hair. It wasn't a marriage of convenience. For him, it was an act of penance. "I'm not her," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't define. "I know," he said, and the profound sadness in those 2 words broke her heart. She didn't know what possessed her to do it. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the raw intimacy of his confession. She rolled on her side to face him. In the faint, ambient light from the window, she could just make out the hard line of his jaw, the shadow of his scars. Slowly, she reached out her hand and let her fingers trace the faint scar on his cheek. It was a gesture of pure, unthinking impulse. His whole body went rigid at her touch. He drew in a sharp, ragged breath. He didn't pull away, but he didn't respond either. He was a statue, carved from stone and memory. Her fingers were gentle, feather-light, as she traced the path of the old wound. It was a map of his pain, and she wanted to understand it. She felt a tremor run through him, a deep, shuddering vibration. "Abigail," he rasped, his voice a broken thing. It was a warning, a plea, but she didn't stop. She let her hand cup his cheek, her thumb stroking his skin. He felt rough, unshaven, real. In that moment, he wasn't the town's tragic figure or her silent partner. He was just a man, wounded and lonely. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in a brilliant, stark flash. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of anguish. It wasn't her touch he was fighting. It was himself. Something inside her, some wall she had carefully constructed, crumbled into dust. She leaned in, her heart pounding a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. She was going to do something reckless, something irreversible. She pressed her lips to his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hesitant, clumsy, born of loneliness and desperation. His lips were firm, unyielding. For a terrifying second, she thought he would reject her, push her away. And then, something broke in him. A low groan escaped his throat, a sound of pure, animal agony and release. His arms snaked around her waist, pulling her against him with a strength that stole her breath. His other hand came up to tangle in her hair, holding her face to his. His mouth opened against hers, and he kissed her back. It was a kiss of devastating force, a deluge of all the unspoken words, the pent-up grief, the suffocating loneliness of the past months. It tasted of whiskey and rain and a deep, soul-shattering sorrow. It wasn't a kiss of love or even a passion. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated need. It was the kiss of two drowning people clinging to the same piece of wreckage. Abigail melted into him, her senses overwhelmed. This was her first kiss. She had imagined it 1,000 times as a young girl, a sweet, gentle thing under a summer moon. The reality was a thunderstorm, a prairie fire, a force of nature that threatened to consume her entirely. It was terrifying, and it was the most alive she had ever felt. He broke the kiss, his breathing ragged, his forehead resting against hers. The storm outside raged, but in the small bed, a new, more dangerous storm had just been unleashed. "We shouldn't have done that," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I know," she whispered back, her own voice trembling. But neither of them moved. He didn't release her, and she didn't pull away. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the rain lashing against the windows, a silent admission passing between them that the lines of their simple contract had just been irrevocably, beautifully, and terrifyingly blurred. The silent prairie, it seemed, had finally found its voice. And it was a roar. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively calm. Inside the ranch house, however, a new kind of storm had taken root. When Abigail awoke, the space beside her was empty. The only evidence that Jacob had been there at all was the faint indentation on the pillow and the blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed. She found him at the stove, his back to her, his shoulders set in a line as rigid as a fence post. The awkwardness was a thick, suffocating blanket. The easy, silent rhythm they had built was shattered. Last night, they had crossed a line, and neither of them knew how to find their way back. "Coffee's ready," he said, his voice a low gravel, not looking at her. "Thank you," she replied, her voice small. She took the cup he offered, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The jolt was electric, undeniable. They both pulled back as if burned. They moved through the morning chores in a state of strained, hyper-aware silence. Every accidental glance, every time they had to work in close proximity in the barn, the air crackled with unspoken tension. The kiss was a living thing between them, a ghost more present than any of the ones they already carried. Jacob was more withdrawn than ever, his face a hard, impenetrable mask. He worked with a frantic energy, throwing himself into the most physically demanding tasks, as if he could sweat out the memory of what had happened. Abigail's insides were a tangled mess of confusion, regret, and a thrilling, terrifying hope. She had initiated the kiss, and his response had been undeniable. But now, in the cold light of day, he was retreating, building his walls higher and thicker than before. She feared she had broken the fragile truce between them, and perhaps broken him a little more in the process. Days turned into a week. They fell into a new, agonizing routine. They were partners in labor, strangers in the house. The shared meals became ordeals of silence, the evenings spent on opposite sides of the living room, the space between them a yawning chasm. The intimacy they had shared in the storm felt like a fever dream. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, Abigail followed him out to the porch where he stood staring into the twilight. "We need to talk about it," she said softly. He didn't turn. "There's nothing to talk about. It was a mistake." The words were a physical blow, sharp and cold. "Was it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. It didn't feel like a mistake. He finally turned to face her, and in the fading light, She saw the raw anguish in his eyes. "Martha," he began, his voice cracking on his late wife's name. "When she died, I died with her. There's nothing left inside me, Abigail. Nothing but ghosts and scar tissue. What happened between us, it wasn't fair to you. And it wasn't fair to her memory. I'm not asking you to forget her," Abigail said, taking a brave step closer. "I would never ask that. But you're not dead, Jacob. You're standing right here. You're breathing. You're fighting. I see you. I see the man you are, not just the man you were." A muscle worked in his jaw. "You don't know me. You don't know the things I've done." "Then tell me," she pleaded. "Stop hiding behind your silence. Let me in." Before he could answer, a flicker of movement on the horizon caught his eye. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. The grieving husband vanished, replaced by the watchful soldier. He tensed, his body becoming a weapon. "Get inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What is it?" "Trouble." Following his gaze, she saw them. A dozen riders, moving not like ranchers, but like a coordinated unit, fanning out as they approached. In the lead was Warren Carmichael, but the men with him were not his usual ranch hands. They were strangers, hard-faced, and carrying rifles with an ease that spoke of long, violent familiarity. Carmichael had hired guns. "He's not waiting for the year to be up," Abigail whispered, a cold dread seeping into her bones. "He's come to take it by force. He's come to finish it," Jacob corrected, his voice grim. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "Go. Get in the house. Bar the door and stay away from the windows." "No," she said, pulling her father's rifle from the hooks just inside the door. "I'm not hiding. Not anymore. This is my home." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, the rifle held steady in her hands. For the first time since the night of the storm, he saw her again, not the ghost of his wife. He saw Abigail Hayes, a woman with as much iron in her spine as any man he'd ever known. A flicker of something, respect, admiration, passed through his eyes. He gave a sharp nod. "All right," he said. "Stay on the porch. Use the railing for cover. Don't fire unless I do. Aim for the horses if you can. A man on foot is less of a threat." He pulled his own pistol from the waistband of his trousers, a big Colt Peacemaker that seemed a natural extension of his hand. He moved to the other side of the porch, sinking into a low crouch, every line of his body radiating a deadly calm. Carmichael and his men reined in their horses just outside the yard, a safe distance from the house. "Colt," Carmichael shouted, his voice thin and reedy in the vast open space. "This is your last chance. Sign the deed over to me, and I'll let you and the woman ride out of here with your lives." "This ranch isn't for sale, Carmichael." Abigail yelled back, her voice clear and strong. Carmichael laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "I'm not asking." He turned to his men. "Burn the barn. Let's see how they like the smell of their livelihood turning to ash." Two of the hired guns dismounted, carrying torches they'd lit from a lantern. As they started toward the barn, Jacob raised his pistol. The setting sun glinted off the long barrel. "That's far enough," his voice boomed, a commander's voice, full of an authority that made the two men hesitate. Carmichael scoffed. "You can't take all of us, Cole." "I don't have to," Jacob replied, his voice chillingly calm. "Just the first one." The world seemed to hold its breath. And then Carmichael gave the signal. The two men with torches ran toward the barn. The next few seconds were a blur of motion and sound. Jacob's pistol fired twice, the reports cracking like thunder. He didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the torches. The first torch flew from a man's hand, landing harmlessly in the dirt. The second man dropped his as a bullet splintered the wood of the handle, a hair's breadth from his fingers. Both men scrambled back in surprise. The other gunman opened fire, a volley of shots splintering the wood of the porch railing and the front of the house. Abigail ducked down, her heart hammering. Jacob was already moving, firing back with methodical precision, not wasting a single shot. He wasn't shooting to kill. He was shooting to disable. A bullet kicked up dirt in front of a horse, making it rear and throw its rider. Another shot shattered a man's rifle stock, rendering the weapon useless. Abigail raised her own rifle. She found a target, one of the gunmen taking aim at Jacob. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man cried out and grabbed his arm, his own shot going wide. A look of stunned surprise and pride flashed across Jacob's face. They were a team. They were fighting together for their home. The firefight was brutal but short. Jacob's skill was terrifying. He moved with an economy of motion, a tactical awareness that the hired guns couldn't match. He was a wolf among sheepdogs. Within minutes, 3 of the men were wounded, and the rest had lost their nerve. They had been paid to intimidate a reclusive widower and a lone woman, not to fight a one-man army. Carmichael, his face pale with fury and disbelief, watched his hired muscle fall apart. He pulled his own pistol, his hand shaking, and aimed it at Abigail. "You!" he shrieked, his composure gone. "This is your fault." Jacob saw the movement. He shouted her name, a raw, desperate cry. He fired his last shot at the same moment Carmichael did. Abigail saw the flash from Carmichael's pistol. She felt a searing, white-hot pain in her left shoulder, the force of it knocking her backward. She hit the porch floor hard, the rifle clattering from her grasp. At the same time, Carmichael slumped in his saddle, a dark stain spreading across his chest, before toppling to the ground. The remaining gunmen, seeing their employer fall, wasted no time. They turned their horses and fled, leaving their wounded comrades behind. Silence descended, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Abigail. Jacob was at her side in an instant, his face a mask of terror. He gently turned her over. Blood was soaking the front of her dress. "It's my shoulder," she gasped, the pain a blazing fire. I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he tore a strip from his own shirt to press against the wound. His hands were shaking. The calm, controlled soldier was gone, replaced by a terrified husband. "Just hold on. Just stay with me." He lifted her into his arms, as if she weighed nothing. He carried her inside, laying her gently on her bed, his movements frantic but careful. His eyes, those stormy gray eyes, were filled with a raw, desperate fear that he made no effort to hide. "You're going to be okay," he said, more to himself than to her. "You have to be." He worked quickly, his past experience with battle wounds all too evident. He cleaned the wound, his touch surprisingly gentle. The bullet had gone clean through, missing the bone. It was painful, but it wasn't fatal. As he bandaged her shoulder, his tears fell on her hand. He wasn't crying from relief. He was crying from the terror of what he had almost lost. When he was done, he sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, his body trembling. "This is my fault," he whispered, his voice choked. "I brought this on you. My past, it always catches up." Abigail reached out with her good hand and touched his hair. It was soft, thick. "No, Jacob," she said, her voice weak but firm. "You saved me. You saved our home." He looked up, his face wrecked with emotion. "When I saw him aim at you in that moment, I realized that if I lost you, it would be worse than losing Martha." He choked on the words, the confession tearing out of him. Losing her was like dying. Losing you would be like being sent to hell after. He finally let her in. He finally told her the truth that had been hiding behind his scars. He loved her, not as a replacement for his wife, but as the woman who had brought him back to life. Tears streamed down Abigail's own face. "I love you too," she whispered. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss so different from their first. It was not born of desperation or loneliness. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, of reverence, of a future just beginning. It was a promise. In the days that followed, the town of Prairie Dust was in an uproar. The wounded gunmen, left behind by their fleeing comrades, were all too willing to confess Carmichael's entire plan to the territorial marshal who arrived to investigate the shootout. They told him about the false debt, the cut fences, the campaign of intimidation, and the final, fatal attack. War in Carmichael's empire, built on lies and greed, crumbled into dust. His name became a curse, while the story of the quiet ranch girl and the sheriff's widower who had stood their ground against a dozen hired guns became the stuff of legend. The townspeople, ashamed of their readiness to believe Carmichael's whispers, came to the ranch in a slow, steady stream, bringing gifts of food, offering to help with repairs, their faces a mixture of apology and awe. They had misjudged Jacob Cole. He was not a monster. He was a hero. And Abigail was not his victim. She was his partner. Their life found a new rhythm, one built not on silence and necessity, but on shared words and quiet affection. As her shoulder healed, they worked side by side, rebuilding what had been damaged, their hands often finding each other in the easy comfort of a shared task. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Jacob finally told her about his past. He had been a U.S. Marshal, a tracker, a man who had lived a life of violence in the name of the law. The scars on his body were from ambushes, knife fights, and the capture of desperate men. He had left it all behind when he met Martha, hoping for a quiet life. When she was killed, he had blamed himself, believing his violent past had somehow called down a curse upon them. She knew the risks of wearing a badge, he said, his voice quiet. But I couldn't forgive myself for not being there. Hiding on my ranch, it wasn't mourning, Abigail. It was a prison I built for myself. And now, she asked, leaning her head on his good shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Now, you've set me free. He turned and kissed her, the gesture as natural as breathing. This land isn't just your father's legacy anymore. It's ours. Let's make it a place where no ghosts can linger. And so they did. They ran the ranch together, their partnership a perfect balance of her deep knowledge of the land and his unyielding strength. The silent prairie, once a symbol of their loneliness, was now the backdrop to their love story. It was a vast, open space not of emptiness, but of possibility. The taciturn ranch girl and the sheriff's widower had been forced into a marriage to save a piece of land. But in doing so, they had found and saved each other, their first kiss setting ablaze a fire that would warm them for the rest of their days. If you enjoyed the story of Abigail and Jacob, please let us know by giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. Did you like the story? Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Your support truly helps our channel a lot. Thanks for watching.